So, thank you all for joining us here tonight. If you don't know who I am, I'm Dave Hofer. I'm a professor of biology and environmental science here at Briarcliff University. And I'm also co-chair of our Northwest Iowa Sierra Group. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the Sierra Group and also on behalf of Nature Conservancy, if I can be that bold, to our event this evening. I just want to take a couple minutes and tell you a little bit about why this event is taking place. Last December, I worked with the Northwest Iowa Sierra Group, and Be Wild, Rewild, a group here in Iowa, was generous enough to provide us with a grant. And in the stipulations of that grant were to stimulate rewilding in Northwest Iowa. So in June, and many of you that I see out here were at our meeting in June, we held an event at the Dorothy Pico Nature Center, and the group decided that what we should be doing is promoting the remaining natural areas that we have here in the Loess Hills and stimulate the idea that we need to rehabilitate them and reconnect them. So on the opening slide I have here, if you actually were to take a shot of that with your camera on the top left, it would take you to our new Rewilding the Prairie page at the Northwest Iowa Sierra Group here on the web. At the bottom right, I will point out that that will take you right to the Nature Conservancy's site on information about the Sioux City Prairie. And then, of course, at the top right, the funders of all of this, Be Wild, Rewild. I'll also point out Bill's right there. So Bill's been rewilding and doing conservation for many, many years and older than most of us. And you see, if you do this long enough, you get this halo that looks like the sun. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Graham Chapman, who's the director of the Iowa Nature Conservancy, who is going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Well, this is great showing. This is wonderful to see so many folks here. Credit, David, to you, Jeannie, I mean, so many folks that worked to put this together. My name is Graham McGaffin. I'm the state director for the Nature Conservancy in Iowa. And it's my honor to introduce Chris Helzer, my colleague, to you this evening. Chris is the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska's Director of Science and Stewardship. Chris is a conservation ecologist, photographer, and published author. He's been with TNC Nebraska since 1997. His photographs and essays, many of you I'm sure have seen them. They're in our media at the Nature Conservancy, not just in Nebraska. His Loess Hills photographs are probably the most used photographs by the Iowa chapter, so thanks, Chris. His essays, as well as the Nebraska Land Magazine, Wildflower Magazine. Chris has also, many of you I'm sure are aware, has created the Prairie Ecologist, which is a very successful blog about prairie ecology and education, and he has authored 2 books published by the University of Iowa Press, The Ecology and Management of Prairies in the Central U.S. and in the Central United States, so you're not abbreviating, and Hidden Prairie, Photographing Life in 1 Square Meter. These all coincide with Chris's goal of introducing the beauty, diversity, and value of grasslands to everyone. Chris is originally from Aurora, Nebraska, and holds bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in wildlife biology and landscape ecology, respectively. Chris lives in Aurora today with his family. He is a member of the Nebraska chapter of the Wildlife Society and the Grassland Restoration Network. He has studied, restored, and photographed prairies for more than 25 years. And I'll offer just super brief, because Chris studied this and he said he thought it was long, but I think that's your modesty, because there's a lot to talk about. I was introduced to Chris just 3 months into my career at the Nature Conservancy. Our past division director, Rob McKim, said, and this is about 15 years ago when blogs were super cool, and he's like, I don't follow many blogs, but I follow the Prairie Ecologist, and I signed up that evening, and I've been a follower ever since, so if you don't, check it out, it's awesome. funny, educational, and Chris, we're just thrilled to have you here tonight. So thank you.
I don't follow any blogs. Well, thanks everybody. It's really nice to be here. I'm going to talk about a lot of things, but mostly what I want to do, and I think this is going to be mostly a friendly audience, but I do spend a lot of time trying to convince people that prairies are interesting. And just as a quick pitch to anybody else that's doing that kind of work, I feel like there are times where, especially if we're scientists, we tend to hit people with a lot of facts early on, and I think that's backwards. I think it's a lot more effective usually to get people fascinated in the natural world, because then you can start from there and you can build toward the facts, and instead of leading with things like climate change and carbon sequestration and fresh water, we can lead with why it's really interesting and fun to be out in nature and all the things that you can see. So you're going to see a lot of that tonight. That's kind of what the whole talk is, just to spoil that. And we'll jump in. So I think when most people think about prairies, most of the general public, right, not of us here, of course, but they just think it's sort of a flat, boring place full of grass, which isn't all that attractive or interesting to people. And of course, that's not the way prairies are, right? Prairies are full of life, full of diversity. Sometimes they really show off spectacularly. Other times you have to look closely to see what's going on down in the grasses. Prairies are a great place to see sky, maybe the best place to see sky. When I go to the mountains, or if I go to a forest, I feel claustrophobic because I can't see what's happening. I can't see a storm until it's right on top of me. That's a really uncomfortable feeling. I don't know why people do that. I like to see storms when they're 20, 30, 50 miles away, and then I can react. It's the best place maybe in the world to see sunrises and sunsets, and they're not flat, right? Just go to the Les Hills of Iowa, you can see that prairies are not flat. Well, some of them are flat. There's some really nice flat prairies too. Bison are one of the big icons of prairies, right? And Scott Motes is here, so I have to say nice things about bison. And they are great, and there aren't very many places in the world that you can still see landscapes full of both prairie and bison, along with skies and these big, spectacular landscapes. And, they are attractive animals. The cows, the bulls, and especially the little calves. The calves are probably our best sales pitch people or animals for prairies. They get together and have little get-togethers. But I want to make a pitch for the other big grazing animal that's on the landscape because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, there aren't a lot of prairies that still have bison, but that doesn't mean they're any less prairie than bison prairies, right? There's some really fantastic prairies, lots of them, but they don't have bison. Many of them have cattle on them. There are a lot of really nice, especially like where I come from in Nebraska, we have the Nebraska Sandhills. It's 12 million acres of contiguous prairie, really well managed for the most part by private ranchers. And cattle can be used in a lot of ways to maintain plant diversity, to create all kinds of different habitat structure that's hard to create without some kind of a selective grazing animal going on. And cattle and bison do some different things, but they do a lot more similarly than they do differently. So that's my quick pitch. If you're trying to get people interested in prairies, a lot of the times we start with birds, right? Because there's a lot of people that are excited about birds. Birds are a great gateway into the diversity of life. Many times we can get people to move on from there into like more advanced topics like insects, but birds are a great place to start. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding about that. But western meadowlarks are a bird that, speaking of grazing, they do really well in a lot of grazed landscapes. They like that kind of shorter structure that you see in a lot of pastures that we have. There are bobolinks that like a little bit more structure, maybe some wetter habitats. Bobolinks are a great one to talk to kids about because they look like a blackbird with a lobotomy, and they sound like R2-D2. It's a beautiful bird to get people interested in prairies with. Dick thistles you can find in just about any prairie now. They do well in smaller prairies. They do well with a lot of wildflowers and even some shrubbiness. And then there are crazy birds like the upland sandpiper, which shouldn't be in the prairie. It looks like it is a shorebird. It's always odd to see them standing on posts, but that's where they feel like they're at home, it seems like. And then there's all kinds of grouse. Prairie chickens, this is a sharp-tailed grouse, which is what we have at our Niobrara Valley Preserve in Nebraska. And all of those birds either nest on the ground or just a little bit off the ground, which is a great strategy. It's a needle in a haystack strategy. It works really well if you have a big haystack. The smaller the haystack, though, the easier it is to find the needle. And so in a lot of our fragmented prairies today, it's harder and harder for those birds to hide their eggs. And so sometimes when it's hard to hide their eggs, something like this happens, which is that you get two different kinds of eggs in the same nest. So this is a bobolink nest with an extra one that came from brown-headed cowbirds. And if you're not familiar with brown-headed cowbirds, they've for a very long time had a really smart parenting strategy, which is that the female bird goes to a meadowlark nest or grasshopper's brown nest and puts her egg in there and then leaves. And that's the last time that that interaction happens between parent and child. And the thing that I want you to think about, if you've not thought about this before, many of you have, is that imagine yourself as a cowbird chick that hatches out in a meadowlark nest, right? So you grew up with meadowlark siblings, you have meadowlark parents, you hear meadowlark songs, and yet somehow, as you grow older, you discover in yourself that you're a cowbird, and you go out and find other cowbirds to have relationships with, and I don't have any idea how it happens. And then some birds don't nest on the ground, they nest in the ground, right? So burrowing owls are closely associated with burrowing animals such as prairie dogs, which is another, just like bison, prairie dogs are another iconic prairie species that is not nearly as common as it used to be. And I'm actually working on a blog post, coincidentally, on this topic where I'm asking the question, bison and prairie dogs are really important for attracting people to prairies, but there's a risk there, which is what I said earlier, which is that not a lot of prairies, most prairies don't have prairie dogs or bison. So I think we have to be careful that we don't tie them so closely together that people are disappointed when they show up and don't see one of those two species, right? But fortunately, there are a lot of other burrowing animals in the prairie, including badgers, which you can still find in a lot of places. There's other mammals like jackrabbits or cottontails, and then small mammals like all the different mice and voles and little tiny things that a lot of times, by the way, use those bigger burrowing animal burrows caused by badgers and things like that for habitat. In fact, I would say badgers are one of the more important architects in the prairie, especially the ones where we don't have prairie dogs, because anything from turtles to small mammals to nesting bumblebees will use those burrows. And if you're not, how do I say this? If you're wandering around a prairie and you say, boy, there's a lot of holes out there that are about volleyball size, there must be an awful lot of badgers in this prairie. There could be, but most of those are hunting holes, right? So badgers are digging up things like ground squirrels out of the ground. So most of the holes that you see out there that a badger dug, they used one time to catch a ground squirrel, and then they leave and they leave it open for everybody else to use, which is why it's so nice, because you don't have to fight the badger to use their hole most of the time. All right, anyway, so there's things like box turtles left in a lot of prairies. If you find a dry enough prairie with a lot of open ground, you'll see lizards, like the spearless lizard from the sandhills in Nebraska. Lots of snakes still out in prairies, most of them perfectly harmless and fun to pick up if you're into that thing. But I'm an insect enthusiast. I'm not an entomologist. I always have to say that right off the front because I'm not trained in this, but I'm a photographer who likes to photograph insects and all the other small creatures. And butterflies are kind of the gateway into that world, right? So lots of people are comfortable with butterflies. There's lots of them big and showy and pretty. Monarchs have been a really nice boon for conservation because a lot of people are excited about monarchs. They're worried about their fate, but it has engaged people in a way that's been hard to do with other things. And so it's really neat to see everybody excited about monarchs. And we can also get them excited about things like regal fritillary butterflies, right? Which is a prairie specialist. Instead of their larvae feeding on milkweed like monarchs do, they feed on violets. And they don't migrate like monarchs, but they hang around all winter long. They're tougher than monarchs. They don't have to go south for the winter. And then there are things, there are butterflies that look like moths, like this skipper. There are a lot of these little skippers that run around out in the prairie. The way you know that they're not a moth and a butterfly is what? How do you know that a moth and a butterfly are different? Anybody know? Look at the antenna. Yes, they have clubbed antennas. So they've got a little club or a knob at the tip of their antenna. So even though they're brown and furry looking like a lot of moths are, that is a butterfly versus this, which is a moth, right? This is a colorful moth. A lot of moths are colorful. They're not little brown things that skulk around in the night. Some of them are. But moths don't have a little club at the end of their antenna. So the males often have these big hairy looking furry antennas because they use those to find the females. They pick up chemical signals with those big antennae. And the females just have like these long straight antennae that don't have any kind of club at the tip. So if you didn't know that, now you have something to take with you out next time you go out on the prairie, and you don't have to know what kind of butterfly or moth it is, but you'll know that it's a butterfly or a moth. And then there's butterflies that look like bumblebees, which is not fair if you're trying to decide what it is. And some of them look like airplanes, which is even weirder. This is a plume moth. A bunch of different species of plume moths out there, they all look like airplanes. And then all of those butterflies and moths start out as caterpillars. And caterpillars are one of the more important food sources in the prairie for lots of things, including grassland birds, small mammals, lots of other insects. So there's a lot of biomass of these little caterpillars running around out there feeding all kinds of other animals. The other big food source for those birds is grasshoppers and their cousins. So this is a grasshopper because it has short antennae, and katydids look like grasshoppers, but they have long antennae. So antennae are a very common way to tell between species. It doesn't work with bison, but it works really well with a lot of insects. And then locusts are not this, right? Locusts are another kind of grasshopper. This is a cicada that many people call locusts. Don't do that, it makes you sound like an amateur. Cicadas are, as real insect enthusiasts know, both live in prairies and the trees outside your house. So even though there are cicadas noisily keeping you awake during the summer outside your house, there's a lot of them that live in prairies. They make the same noises or similar noises there too. I like the little insects that people don't know as much about, that hide in the grass a little bit better. So little things like this plant hopper with a long nose, or this plant hopper that looks exactly like a leaf. This is called a two-lined plant hopper. And then, just like monarchs, the whole pollinator community has become a really great way to talk to people about conservation. One of the nice things about pollinators is that if you have good pollinator habitat, you pretty much have good habitat for everything else. It's almost a one-to-one comparison. So getting people excited about pollinators, you get them into biodiversity, and you get them into all the sort of habitat conditions that we're looking for most other species. Whether it's bumblebees or all the different other bees that I'm going to talk about more later, but they come in all different sizes, shapes, and colors, which is an important thing to think about. They're not just honeybees. There are a lot of honeybees, but there's much more interesting bees out there than just those. And we only have bees because we first had wasps. So wasps are not always where I lead off with when I'm trying to get people excited about prairies. But once I get you fascinated in other things, I can take the chance to talk about wasps, okay? So here's the first thing you need to know about wasps. All adult wasps are nectar feeders. So you'll see them on flowers because all the adults, all they eat is nectar or some other sweet liquid like from rotting fruit. And when they're on those flowers, the last thing that they want to do is have a fight. So you don't have to worry about your safety if you're just watching a wasp on a flower. In fact, if you really want to freak out somebody, especially high school kids on a tour through a prairie, you just put your finger right out in front of that little wasp as it's feeding, and it'll crawl on your finger, and you can hold it up in the air and show it to people. And then it'll eventually go back, you can put it back on the flower, or it'll fly back to the flower. Because it has nothing to defend, right? And most wasps are solitary wasps, meaning that they don't have a queen and workers and this whole society, and they don't have anybody that's dedicated to defense. This is a paper wasp. Paper wasps are one of the ones that are social wasps. And they do have that society, right? So there are paper wasps, and their whole job is to defend the nest. But even the social wasps are not out defending anything when they're feeding on flowers. And solitary wasps, which is the vast majority of species, it's a single mom with usually a hole in the ground, or not even a nest, and her job is to feed her kids. And while the adults eat nectar, the kids eat meat. So the adult wasp goes out and, for example, might sting a grasshopper and paralyze it, and then dig a hole and bury the grasshopper and lay an egg on it. Or she might go dig a hole somewhere and go catch a katydid, and then bring the katydid to the hole, put it in the hole, lay an egg on it. And the last thing that she wants to do is get in some kind of a scrape with somebody big and scary like us, because if she dies, then her kids are done and the nest is done and her line ends, right? I say all this because wasps are fascinating, and also they're the progenitors of bees. So we had wasps first, and then we got bees that came out of wasps, and we got ants that came out of wasps. So we have way more wasp is a really hard word to say. We have way more species of wasps than we do bees. All right, there's something like 20,000 different kinds of wasps just in North America. And we've got about 4,000 kind of bees, which is a lot of bees, but not nearly as many as wasps. So if you haven't been fascinated by wasps before, I hope you'll go home and start learning about them because they're really, really neat. So they're pollinators, but they are also predators, but again, not for themselves, right? So they're predators for their kids. And this is an example of this. There's so many examples, but this is one. Anybody know what it is? This is a mud dauber. Mud daubers have these really long, skinny waists. And then you might know them better by the little mud enchiladas that they make on your house or else your door in your garage. So what they do is they gather mud, and it's fascinating to watch them do this because they use their feet, their front legs, to scrape up wet soil and make a perfect little sphere that then they carry between their mandibles and their chest, like that. And they'll carry that in between their mandibles and their chest back to wherever she's going to build her little nest. And I don't know how many times she has to do that to make a 1.5 to 2 inch long tube. And then she goes out and she catches spiders. She paralyzes spiders, stuffs them in the tube, still alive, but paralyzed, lays an egg on there, and then the horror movie starts because the larva feeds on those spiders, which are still alive until the last possible second, which keeps them fresh. It's a great strategy. So if you're not a fan of spiders, you should be a big fan of the mud dauber wasp, okay? And then a lot of those 20,000 or so wasps, one of the reasons we don't know about them is they're so tiny. A lot of them are not described by science yet. We know they exist, but we haven't named them yet because they're small and hard to study. And then, like I said, ants also came from wasps. So ants are basically social wasps that gave up flight, except when they have sex, which seems right. But ants are also major predators. So they are really good at teamwork, and they can be very effective predators. They can gang up on something. If you ever see caterpillars that are really spiky looking, those spines we think are an adaptation against ant predation. Because a soft-bodied caterpillar has no chance against ants, but if it's big and spiny, it keeps those ants at bay, at least to some extent. But the other thing about ants is that besides being just predators, they have a sweet tooth, which leads to some really interesting behaviors, such as farming aphids. So these little aphids here, those little yellow things, feed on plants, and they're feeding on the liquids in plants, and they're feeding on the sugars, but there's so much coming through them, they can't handle it all. And so some of it just sort of comes bubbling out the back end. You've been there. And the ants will feed on that by taking advantage of that sugary liquid called honeydew, which is a really nice name for that liquid, I think. And they'll come around and just feed on that sugary liquid. And then while they're doing that, they protect those ants from predators like ladybugs or other things that are wanting to feed on the ants. So it's a great system for both of them. But it's not just that. The other thing that the sweet tooth of ants has led to is it's led to some species of plants creating what we call extrafloral nectar. So you know about flowers making nectar in the blossoms themselves, but a lot of these plants, and partridge bee here is one, sunflowers are another one that I see this a lot on, and they just sort of have these little sunflowers just have little bubbles of sweet liquid that come out different parts of the plant. Partridge bee takes it an extra step, and they make a little cup that they put it in, or a little bowl, and you can see that little droplet of liquid inside there. And ants will come and just sort of drink out of it like a little dog out of a dog bowl. It's really fun to watch. So if you've never watched this before, if you find partridge bee, which is a little native annual wildflower, and you watch it long enough, you'll see these ants running up and down. You'll see those little red cups, and you'll find those ants crawling around there just drinking right out of the cups. It's really amazing. And then because ants are on sunflowers and all these other places, along with pollinators, you've got predators, right, that are waiting on those flowers, taking advantage of that, just like a crocodile in a watering hole in Africa. And one of the big ones that you see there are crab spiders. Crab spiders are ambush predators. They have silk, but they don't make webs, right? They use the silk for other things like making shelters or tying their eggs all together in a big sack. Another spider that doesn't use a web is the lynx spider. Lynx like the cat, like the wild cat. These are spiders that chase down their prey, they get close, and then they make a final jump and jump on them. Similarly, the jumping spiders do that. And if you're not a fan of spiders and you want to start, which of course you do, you should start with jumping spiders, because they're the cute little teddy bears of the spider world. Big eyes, cute fuzzy little bodies. You can hold them in your hand, you can hold them in one hand and they'll jump to the other hand. And if you move your other hand out of the way as they jump, they only fall about 6 or 8 inches because they've got a safety line that they attach every time before they jump. So they fall down about 6 inches and they crawl back up to your hand again. Great with kids. A lot of people keep them as pets. So jumping spiders, the gateway into the spider world, because you were looking for that, right? As opposed to the wolf spiders, which are amazing, but maybe not the place to start, because these are the ones that really freak people out because they carry the babies with them. So you've heard stories about you step on a big spider and all of a sudden there's 1,000 little spiders. It's not that the big spider became 1,000 little spiders. You killed the mom and the babies are running around looking for safety, so well done. But these are the best moms in nature, probably, because they carry their kids around as eggs. They carry a great big egg sac around with them until the eggs hatch, and then they carry the kids around for even longer. There's not many people that do that. Well, except all the women in the room, right? And then there are, of course, spiders with webs. And there's lots of different species of them. Not all of them have big circular webs. There's funnel web spiders. There's one of these that lives in our window every fall, and we let her stay there and catch flies, because there's a bunch of flies that come onto our windows in our living room. Eventually the web gets big enough that it starts to be annoying, but that's about when she disappears, and then we just clean up the web and wait until next year. You all do that too, right? Sure you do. Lots of other predators. So dragonflies, assassin bugs, the world is full of predators, which is great, because if there wasn't, we'd be full of all kinds of things that would be overpopulated. Okay, I want to tell a few stories about plants. So plants are also great. Wildflowers, another great way to get people excited about prairies. Prairies tend to be fairly subtle most of the time in terms of their plant parties and showing off. But there are times, of course, that it's spectacular. But a lot of times you have to kind of go out and look for the plants. It's like an Easter egg hunt. You don't necessarily see them from a distance, but when you get out there, there's a lot to find. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about plants is how they move. So seeds is one way, right? You can have seeds that are moved by wind or water or animals. And this is how plants can move relatively long distances, or at least send their kids out to go out in the world. The problem with seeds is the return on investment has to be good, because the risk is really, really high. The vast majority of seeds never turn into anything other than food for something, or they just sort of land somewhere and desiccate until they die. When it works, it's great. But if you think about what a seed has to do to succeed, it's a lot, right? It's got to land on bare soil, which that alone is unlikely. And then it's got to get the moisture and potentially sunlight it needs to germinate, which is also unlikely. And even if it does, it has to then compete with whatever is already there. And usually there's something there. The world is not just a bunch of bare ground waiting for new plants, right? So all of those things have to go right, and it just doesn't happen very often. But when it does work, it is allowing plants to move a long distance. They can share genes. They can because they have to get pollinated and make seed. That means they're interacting genetically with another one. You can get better genetic diversity. Lots of good things about seeds. But if you're a perennial plant, seeds are not the most important way to reproduce. Most perennial plants have buds at the base. So prairie plants, not woody plants, not trees and shrubs, right? These perennial plants have these little buds at the base, and those buds are what next year's plants come from. So at the end of a season, everything above the ground on these perennial plants, sunflowers, daisies, prairie clovers, things like that, they die back to the ground, and then the next season they start from a bud and they grow again, right? Which is why prairie fires in spring especially don't really have a lot of impact on these plants, because they don't have anything still invested above ground. They're just poised and ready to go. And so when you think about, you might have heard the concept of a seed bank, right? In the soil, there's a seed bank. There's a bunch of seeds there ready to germinate. Those are okay. Those are relatively important, but really what's more important in the prairie is the bud bank. It's the capacity of a prairie to regenerate every year from the ground, from these buds that are on all these plants. The really cool thing I think about buds is that as long as a perennial plant like this, has enough energy at the end of the year to make one bud, it'll survive another year. And it can do that over and over and over again.
trees make tree rings so we can see how long they've done that and how long they've lived. And these prairies don't. They make brand new tissue every year. So we have no idea how old these plants are. But just speaking logically, some of them have to be very, very old, right? And not all of them make buds at the base. There are a lot of plants that have what are called rhizomes. They're these underground stems. And if you look at those rhizomes, there are buds on those too. So they can make buds that are far away from them, that they can still support new plants from. And pretty soon, you can have these plants that make these entire clones, which is the same genetic individual, same plant, but it gets to be big and bigger and bigger. And some of them can be acres and acres in size. And at that point, they're pretty much immortal. What's gonna kill it, right? It's not like a badger's gonna dig up one plant because it's 3 acres in size or bigger. And so there have to be prairie plants in Iowa and Nebraska that are thousands of years old. There have to be. But we can't prove it. The forest people can prove it. We can't prove it. But we can use logic and we can outwit them and we can tell them our prairie plants are older than trees. Things like big blue stem. Prairie sandreed is another great example if you're familiar with that plant, because the rhizomes are very long so that they can grow to tens of acres in size for one individual plant. So prairie plants live forever. Go home and tell your friends. And then some of them have an additional strategy like pussy toes, where they have those rhizomes and the buds and they can live a long time, but they also use a chemical warfare to compete against the plants around them. So they put a chemical into the soil that slows down the growth of grasses around them, which if they're in a grazing environment, those shorter grasses are actually attractive to grazing animals. So they get additional help from the grazing animals that graze the grasses down and keep them even shorter, and the pussy toes is the first thing to bloom in the spring, so they don't care. They take advantage of all that extra sunlight, and it's a brilliant strategy for survival. All right, let's talk about sunflowers for a second. I already talked about the extra floral nectar that sunflowers make. Fascinating. But there are 9 species of sunflowers in Nebraska. I assume the same is true for Iowa, give or take, right? Real close. 2 of those in Nebraska are annuals, the rest are perennials, so they can live forever or so. Sunflowers have a lot of pollen and nectar, really good resources, and some of those are used by generalist bees, and some of them are used by bees like this one, which is a specialist on sunflowers. It can feed from any of those sunflowers, but it really relies upon sunflower pollen and nectar. And then there are lots of them that are generalists, things like this little tree cricket that takes advantage of the fact that sunflowers puts out a bunch of food on a platter, doesn't make it hard to get. They don't hide them inside a little closed up flower like a lot of others do. They just sort of, here it is, come and take it. Great resources for everybody, which of course brings predators, because there's lots of things to come feed on for predators. There are lots of things that eat the leaves too, like this lubber, this plains lubber grasshopper, which is a grasshopper but doesn't feed on grass. It feeds on wildflower leaves, mostly annual sunflowers, at least in Nebraska. And then of course the seeds are a tremendous resource. That's why if you feed birds, you might use sunflower seeds. We also like to eat sunflower seeds ourselves. Lots of nutrition in a nice big package that attract things like red-winged blackbirds in the fall. Bison and cattle both like to chew on sunflowers, especially early in the flowering, when there's a bunch of nutrients sort of packed into one little package ready to go. Cattle do the same thing. And so you see a lot of sunflowers early in their season with a lot of the top snip dog. Deer will do this too. So I say all this to tell a quick story. In 2012, at our Niobrara Valley Preserve in Nebraska, north central Nebraska, north edge of the Sandhills, there was a summer wildfire. Temperatures were around 100 degrees, very, very strong winds. Scott was there a couple days into it, or a day or two into it. It was a wild, wild fire. 70-some thousand acres burned, okay? This is one of our bison pastures up there. We have a 10,000 acre bison pasture, 95% of it burned. And you look at that and you say, ooh, that seems bad, right? But as prairie people, if you're prairie people, you know that the prairie is not the problem here. The prairie comes back really well. But one of the fun things is to watch how that happens. And between the drought and the wildfire, the next season, that pasture looked like this. Just incredibly full of annual sunflowers. And really a lot of the sandhills look like that, but not nearly as dense as where that wildfire had gone through. So all those things that I just talked about sunflowers provided, they provided in a year that was recovering from drought and wildfire, and there were a lot of plants that weren't going to have a great year there. There was going to be a sort of a scarcity of resources, except for plants like sunflowers who were able to step up in huge numbers and sort of fill that gap. So this is part of what makes ecosystems resilient, is that no matter what happens, there are always species that are adapted to whatever that situation is, and they can step up and fill the roles that they need to fill. And we can actually create something similar with our fire and grazing management. So this is a site that we burned in the spring in our bison pasture. The bison are grazing it very short. You can see most of the plants there are very short in this early July photo. And by August, that same pasture was full of wildflowers, not just sunflowers, not just annuals, but also perennials. So those 9 species of sunflowers each play different roles, but they're similar enough to each other they can sort of fill in for one another if conditions change. And also, because they're different species, they have different sort of niches in the environment that they fill. So some of them do really well up on high, dry areas, some of them do well in low, wet areas, some can handle shade. They're, again, annuals and perennials, which means that pretty much wherever you go in Nebraska or Iowa, you're likely to see a sunflower of some kind. But it also means that as the climate continues to change and conditions change, we'll probably still have sunflowers everywhere we go, but they might be different sunflowers 20 years ago than they were 20 years, or 20 years from now as they were 20 years ago, right? So species may shift around, but we'll probably still have sunflowers, which is good news for everything that uses them. And then I want to talk about milkweed, because I think when most people think about milkweed, they think about something that looks like that, right? But there's a lot of different species of milkweed out there, different colors, different sizes, and there's value in that. So milkweed are really good for pollinators, especially wasps, which everybody knows now are pollinators. They're really good at eating nectar. They also have a lot of specialized insects that feed on them, right? Things like this red milkweed beetle, or this large milkweed bug, which by the way is a migratory species. Did you know that? A good proportion of large milkweed populations or milkweed bug populations every year migrate south, and then the next generation of them migrate back up north. But some of them stay here for the winter, which means they're really hedging their bets, because if the migratory population dies, because it's a rough trip, we've still got the home population here, right? But if the home population dies because it's a terrible winter, we've got the migratory population that can come back. So it's a really intriguing strategy for an insect that does not look like it should migrate. And then there's lots of other species of insects that specialize on milkweeds, including, of course, monarch butterfly caterpillars, right? And if you see this picture, there's 3 different caterpillars on 3 different kinds of milkweed, because they'll use any of those milkweed species that I showed before. And that is really important. So we talked about resilience and diversity with sunflowers. The same thing is true with milkweeds, and I want to give you an example of when it was really important. So in Nebraska and Iowa, our monarchs leave in the fall and they fly to Mexico, right? So those individuals that are here go all the way to Mexico, they overwinter in Mexico. Those same individuals then come into the southern US the next spring. They lay eggs in places like Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and then when those eggs hatch, the butterflies that come out of those eventually are the ones that come up to Iowa and Nebraska. And at least where I'm at in Nebraska, we see them in May, like early to mid-May usually. Well, in 2017, we saw monarchs in April, which is weird. There was something going on weather-wise. They pushed all the way up from Mexico without stopping to lay eggs further south, and they came to Nebraska looking desperately for places to lay eggs and looking desperately for food. Dandelions were one of the few things that were blooming when they showed up, because it was pretty early. And the common and showy milkweeds, the big pink flowered, big leaved plants that we think of monarchs using the most, had just all been frosted off by a cold snap. So they weren't available, and the monarchs were in big trouble. Well, fortunately, because we have 17 milkweed species in Nebraska, we have some with skinny little leaves that aren't affected by cold nearly as much. And so whorled milkweed, which monarchs use now and then, became the major source of food for the caterpillars that those monarchs laid eggs for. So here's whorled milkweed that spring with an egg and a caterpillar. And if you look closely at the caterpillar, there's another little speck on that caterpillar. That's a parasitoid egg, which is from a fly or a wasp. I'm not good enough to tell you. But it's a species that relies on monarch caterpillars for its survival, and it lays eggs on them, and when the egg hatches, it burrows inside and does bad things to the caterpillar. But they have to be there anyway. We need parasitoids just like we need predators. But the point is that because we had a variety of different kinds of milkweeds, we were able to support not only a monarch population, but also some of the things that rely on monarchs. And by summer, they grew up They became monarchs that were able to, have a couple generations and then fly south again. So ecological resilience relies heavily on having a diversity of plants and a diversity of insects across the ecosystems. And the last example of that I want to give you is with bees. So I talked about honeybees very briefly. I want to talk about honeybees really quick now, and then I don't want to talk about them again, okay? So honeybees are fascinating. They're amazing creatures. If you learned about bees in school, what you really probably learned about was honeybees, right? They just said bees, but they meant honeybees. Because you learned about the hives, you learned about the queens and the workers and the little dance they do to tell each other where the food is. Really cool. But they're European livestock that Europeans brought to the US, right? They're not native here. They're the state insect of Nebraska for some reason. They should have made our state bird the chicken, but they didn't. They could just follow the pattern, everybody. Anyway, honeybees are great, but they're not native. They do an okay job on pollinating for some wildflowers, but there's most of our native wildflowers, honeybees do nothing for, okay? And they can compete with our native bees and other pollinators for the same resources where they are. So they're kind of a mixed blessing, right? What's more important, the other thing with those is they're not going anywhere, right? You hear about the pollinator crisis, honeybees are not part of that. Honeybees are having a rough time with the varroa mites and diseases and things like that. But if a honeybee colony disappears, whoever owns that colony is going to order another one on Google, and they'll get another one and start it up again. So it's a pain and it's expensive and there's issues, but they're not going extinct any more than chickens are. Okay? So don't worry about honeybees in the global pollinator crisis. Worry about things like bumblebees, because there are about 20 different species of bumblebees in Nebraska and Iowa, and some of them are not doing very well. They are social like honeybees. They've got queens and workers. They don't overwinter though. The only bumblebees that survive the winter are next year's queens that go into a place like a badger hole or someplace underground, and they wait for the next spring, and then they come out and have to start a colony from scratch by themselves. But most bees are not social. They're solitary, just like those wasps we talked about earlier. So it's a single mom bee. There's maybe 400 or so species of bees in Nebraska, probably the same for Iowa, about 4,000 or more in North America. And again, all different shapes and sizes and colors, but most of them live in a hole in the ground. And so the females will dig a hole, usually either in a hole in the ground or in a hollow stem of a plant. They'll go out and they'll find nectar and pollen, often mix it together in a little dough ball. They'll take it back to their tunnel, they'll put it down there, they'll lay an egg next to it, seal it up in a little cell, and then they stack those cells of food and egg on top of each other throughout that tunnel. And then when the eggs hatch, the larvae can feed on that food their mom brought for them until it becomes big enough to pupate, become an adult, and then either later that year or the next year they come out as an adult and keep the cycle going, okay? But it's all done by one single mom, that's it. The males of the species, of all these solitary species, have no other job other than to mate with females. So they hang around flowers. If you ever watch bees at flowers, and you'll see some of them diligently working, and you'll see others that are just sort of flying chaotically around. The chaotic ones, those are the males. I make no other statements about that. The females, when they're not going out and getting food, they hang out the nest because they've got to protect the nest because there's nobody else to do it. So things like wasps or other things might come in there and try to eat their babies or the food that they left for them. So they've got a lot of work to do. The only nice thing is they can actually spend the night in these tunnels. The males don't have a home, so if you go out early in the morning when it's dew and there's dew all over the grass and the flowers, you'll see a bunch of bees that are stuck out there, just sort of stuck in the dew. Almost all of those are males because they don't have anywhere else to go. Don't feel bad for them, they're okay. The other thing with bees is most of these solitary bees are fairly generous. So they can feed on lots of different kinds of flowers, which is great because they can regulate the nutrition that their kids need. They can go out and find the flower that best matches exactly what their babies need, as long as there's a wide selection of flowers, right? But there are exceptions to that rule, and this is one of them. This is called a blue sage bee. It's one of my favorite bees of all time because it's the flower that it depends on is blue sage or pitcher sage. It's the only flower it can feed on. It's the only flower it can feed its kids with. And its eye matches the color of the flower, which is amazing. So, it has a nest, but it can only be out and active when pitcher sage is blooming, right? So it's tied to this late summer period when pitcher sage blooms. From a climate change standpoint, this is one of the ones that we're scared of, right? That the phenology, the blooming time of plants is shifting. We already know that's happening. We've tracked it, it's happening. which means that the timing of when these bees come out of the ground as adults has to change with the flowering of the plants. So far they're making it work. We'll see if they continue to do that. But this is one of the ones that's real tied to the risks of climate change and that shifting of blooms. And then we talked about brown-headed cowbirds earlier, right? This is a cuckoo bee, which basically has the same strategy as a brown-headed cowbird except with bees. So cuckoo bees will go lay their eggs in the nests of other bees, mostly solitary bees. They take off. The cuckoo bee egg hatches. It feeds on the food that was there for the host bee's baby. The host bee's baby doesn't get any food, but the cuckoo bee does. And then it grows up to an adult and goes out and continues the cycle. It's such a great parenting strategy that it's evolved separately in birds and wasps and bees and even some fish. It works really well, I'm told. To tie it all together with resilience in bees, flowers, the diversity of flowers that we have in prairies, which is super important for lots of things, relies on a diversity of pollinators, not just bees, but other pollinators as well. Because if one bee is having a rough year, there are other bees that can do the same job and pollinate the flowers. But at the same time, those bees rely on lots of flowers for the reasons I just talked about, right? They need consistent flowers through the season. Most flowers only bloom for a little bit of time, so they've got to be replaced by something else. And the more diversity, the more selection there is for those bees, the better they can regulate their diet for their kids. And if you've got a diversity of flowers and a diversity of bees, you probably have a really healthy prairie. And so it's great that people care about pollinators right now. Okay, I want to shift gears just for this last little bit. I want to talk about stewardship of prairies. And I want to start by recognizing that stewardship of prairies by humans has been going on for as long as prairies in the central US have been here. Right? So the last ice age ended 8 to 12,000 years, depending on where you're at. That's a long time ago. Humans were on the continent for at least 10,000 years before that, maybe longer, depending on who we believe right now scientifically. So humans have been here a very long time. And humans are even back then, humans were very good about intentional land stewardship. And in a lot of ways, the prairies that we have in this part of the world are probably here because of humans, right? So after the ice retreated, we had these spruce forests that were starting to show up as the climate was shifting. And the fact that humans were using fire fairly frequently pushed a lot of areas to grassland rather than woodland. And then that's continued on since then. And people used fire for attracting bison populations across a lot of the plains, because if you burn, that's where the bison are going to come feed, and you know where to go hunt. But they would use fire for lots of other reasons too. They moved plants around, very intentionally moved plants around, cultivated the landscape in a lot of different ways. The hunting that they did affected the prey species and their behavior patterns, which affected a whole cascade of other things. So humans have been stewarding the earth for 20 to 30,000 years across the globe, really, really importantly here. And that's important to recognize for at least two big reasons. Okay, the first is giving people credit for what has been happening for the last 10,000 years and continues to happen, right? And the second is, it means that we have a responsibility as the humans that are here today to continue that stewardship into the future. Because these ecosystems are tied so strongly to people that it's not something we can just walk away from. So the idea of letting nature take its course is a false thing. That doesn't exist. That's not right in prairies especially. If we walk away from prairies, they turn into something else. They degrade, they lose species diversity, and they turn into something that's not very good and not very resilient especially. So we have a responsibility as people to manage prairies. The only question is how we do it and what's the best way. Okay? Anybody want to challenge me or talk about that? It's really important. Okay. And as stewards, what we really need to think about is resilience. So all these things I've been talking about, maintaining that diversity of life so that there's redundancy in the system and it'll sustain itself over time. And I want to just talk scientifically about what that means, at least from the way I think about it, okay? So if you picture a ball in a bowl, and the ball is a prairie, and the bowl is sort of the where that prairie can live and move around and change within and still be the same kind of prairie. So you can have a prairie moving around in this space, and it gets pushed around by different land management activities. It gets pushed around by weather patterns, drought, wet periods, all those sorts of things. And it shifts around as it moves around and looks very different from time to time. Sometimes it's really short, sometimes it's really tall and dense, sometimes it's sparse, sometimes it's not. It looks very different, but it's still the same prairie. It's still providing the same basic functions, supports the same kinds of species, say the soils, all those sort of things are sort of standard and still there. But it can be pushed hard enough that it leaves that bowl and it goes to a different bowl where it can also be resilient, but in a very different form. So examples of that. And it doesn't go back to where it was. So let me show you some examples. If you take a prairie and you turn it into a soybean field, even for a year or two, you can't just stop farming and expect the prairie to come back the way it was. It doesn't work that way. It's in a new bowl, okay? Similarly, if you allow trees to come into a prairie, at some point you cross a threshold and you stop having a prairie with trees and now you have a woodland with openings. And prairies and woodlands are very different in many ways. They have different habitat conditions, so they support different species, but even more importantly, things like soil chemistry change. And soil chemistry doesn't just flip back. So if you take the trees out of a site after it's crossed that threshold, it doesn't become a prairie again. It becomes something else. It moves into yet another bowl, but it's not the bowl that we started with that has the resilience and the diversity that we were hoping to keep around. And then the one that's really tricky is you can get to a point in something that still looks kind of like a prairie, where you've lost enough of your species diversity through things like chronic overgrazing or broadcast herbicide use or whatever, or sometimes just managing the prairie in the exactly same way for too many years. You lose that diversity to the point where it seems to cross a threshold and it's not going to recover back to where it was. And I've had a lot of experience managing prairies like this for the Nature Conservancy that we purchased back in the late 80s or early 90s. And we've spent 30 years or more managing them with strategies that we know facilitate resilience and diversity. We know it works. And they won't come back. They don't get the diversity back that we know they used to have. So we've moved into a different bowl with some of these sites. So what that means is that as land managers, our real job is to keep that ball in the bowl. Now I would argue it's also important for us to move the ball around in the bowl, to exercise it, and to keep that bowl stretched out. Because if we don't manage prairies and put them through their paces and give annual plants, for example, a chance to come in now and then because we get rid of all the stuff on top of them that keeps the sun from hitting the soil. If we don't do those things, we start to lose pieces of the prairie that are not there to respond when we need them. So we've got to exercise the ball, keep the bowl stretched out, and then it'll hopefully stay in that bowl for a long time. And there's really two pillars of ecological resilience in grasslands that as land managers we think about. The one is the species diversity. Most of what I've talked about, right? Diversity of species, whether it's sunflowers, milkweeds, or bees. More species, more resilience. And then the second piece is the size and connectivity of habitat. So larger patches of habitat have larger populations of species, which are less likely to just disappear from a random event. And if we can't have size, we can connect them together, and we can get size that way. It allows species populations to interact with each other and support each other, and they're more viable that way. So to maintain resilience, we need to protect habitats. Don't allow them to, let's not lose any more habitat, allow it to become fragmented. Where we have opportunities, we can restore habitat, we can rebuild some of the size and connectivity that's out there, and then we have to manage the diversity of life that's in those habitats. And I want to just focus on that last one for a minute as I finish up, okay? So, as I said earlier, we can't just walk away from natural areas, especially prairies, and expect them to be okay. Success for land managers does not mean, no matter how many times I get asked this question, it does not mean getting the prairies to the point where we can just walk away. That's not the goal, okay? We're not ever gonna walk away, we can't. And one of the reasons is that prairies have these buds at the base, we talked about earlier. They put up new growth every year. If you don't get rid of the old growth, it starts to build up as this thatch, this brown dead stuff that covers the soil, changes the temperature of the soil, doesn't allow light through. Just simply that alone is going to be problematic, right? Trees will come into the prairie without the use of fire to keep them out. We get lots of trees. CO2 in the atmosphere, the climate change that we're seeing right now is favoring trees even more, which makes it even more challenging as prairie managers to keep it in the bowl and not allow it to move to something else. And deciduous shrubs are even worse than those eastern red cedars I showed in the previous one. Because fire doesn't kill them, it just sort of sets them back. So things like dogwood or smooth sumac are a real challenge for prairie managers that are trying to maintain open grassland. And regardless of whether it's a woody plant or a grass or a wildflower, if there's not management, whatever species are best adapted to that sort of idle state are going to become dominant, and they're going to push everybody else out of the way. And often it's things like smooth brome, which is not ideal, right? So this is not great pollinator habitat. There's no wildflower diversity. It's not even grass diversity. So even if you're just a cow, you run out of food in the summer because smooth brome goes dormant in the summer. So species diversity disappears without human stewardship. So one of the most important strategies that we have as human stewards is the use of fire. So this person is carrying a drip torch, which is a really great tool that allows us to move fire around. I'm going to give you a quick demonstration how this works, and for the sake of simplicity, I've simplified the photo. I've made a little person with a drip torch. For no particular reason, we're going to call this person Scott. And Scott is going to go light a fire. So Scott has prepared this site for fire by mowing a big path around the outside of this prairie. So you've got prairie with a lot of tall vegetation, but you've got this strip of very short vegetation all around it, right? Which isn't going to burn as well. It's important for control. See the arrow here showing you where the direction of the wind, okay? So wind is blowing from left to right, which means Scott's going to start the fire on the downwind side. Now, Scott's already had a mistake. If you know anything about fire, Scott really should have started in a corner because he got better control. But for the sake of this illustration, he started on the flat side, and that's okay. We'll give him this, okay? But we're starting on the downwind side because the wind wants to push the fire that way, but it can't. Why? Because it's short. There's not much to burn. Exactly. So Scott and his friends can start a fire there, keep it from burning into the short, let it back into the wind slowly, and then eventually start working around the edges, and you start working toward the wind, and you start to accumulate black here in the areas that have burned, which is, again, moving slowly this way. This fire now is starting to catch the wind and move that way, but it's going to run into the stuff that's already burned, so it can't get away. And eventually you wrap around to the other side if you're doing sort of the basic plan here. And as you light along that final end, the wind is starting to push that fire pretty well, but it's got this big catcher's mitt of black that it's going to run into and go out, okay? So if you've never been on a prescribed fire before, if you've never seen how it works, this is the basic plan most of the time. Any questions about that? It's a really cool system, right? Good job, Scott. Okay, so what happens on the line then is you've got somebody with a drip torch being followed by somebody with water, usually kind of spraying the fire out in that short area to keep it from spreading. There's another picture of what that can look like. Sometimes, to make it even better, we'll go around first with water and put down water in the grass that's mowed short to make it even burn less, right? And then you can light along that. You can see the wet strip there, the kind of darker. The other thing I want you to notice is how much fire, or how short that fire is behind Mary there. When it's burning into the wind, back into the wind, it's not a very strong fire. It's not a very aggressive fire. So here's another picture, and then sometimes we also have these little hand tools called flappers. We have rakes, things like that. But water is the most useful. And then as we turn the corner and the wind starts to catch the fire and push it toward all that other black, then we get the bigger flames that you usually see in the pictures of people that talk about prescribed fire. Because when people like to brag about their fires, they don't show you the little flames, they show you the big flames. And those big flames are important because they're what helps set back things like smooth sumac and dogwood and those other shrubs, and things like eastern red cedar trees. So if you look at a fire from the edge or from the air as it's finishing up, if we did our job well as managers, there's a nice smooth edge around the edge. I would like to see those smooth edges. And as it burns down, you can kind of see what burned and what didn't. And then within a few days, usually, if it's during the growing season, you get this really lush green grass, right? Taking advantage of the fact that all that thatch, all that dead stuff that was on top of the plants is gone. Soil warms up, the light hits those plants, those buds, all those little buds in the bud bank deploy. And some of the plants start from seeds. So some of the seeds that we're lucky enough to land where they can grow can germinate and start to add themselves to the plant community too. Everybody's happy except the cedar trees that are dead. And the deciduous trees that are not dead, but they have to start over from the base, which they're not good at, right? Prairie plants, herbaceous plants, are good at starting from the base, and trees like to start where they left off last year, right? So they grow this far, and the next year they grow a little bit further. But if they get burned off, they have to start way over at the beginning, which really sets them back several years. So that's fire. But we have other tools for stewardship, including grazing animals. We talked about bison and cattle. I mostly use cattle on the sites that I manage. So I'm going to talk about them. One of the great things about all these animals, though, these selective grazing that they do can create some patchiness in the habitat structure that's really hard to make in any other way. And that provides easier pathways for animals, for example, to move around, provides different light conditions and growing conditions for plants. You can do more grazing pressure, which makes more short grass and fewer forbs, or you can have lighter pressure with more stuff that doesn't get eaten. There's a lot of ways to regulate that. You can use cattle and bison bolts to help with some of our invasive species like sweet clover. So on the left side of the fence where the cows are not, you can see a lot of yellow sweet clover. On the right side of the fence where the cows have eaten all the sweet clover, you don't see any sweet clover. And as we manage these, we're looking for what we call habitat heterogeneity. We want patches of different habitat structure, tall, short, patchy. We want those spread across the landscape. So as an example in this picture, where the yellow is not sweet clover, but sunflowers, we have 4 different types of habitat spread across a 200-acre prairie, created by fire and grazing combinations. On the ground, it looks something like this, where you've got some areas that are short, tall. You've got some areas with lots of thatch, because nothing's happened for a couple years. You've got some areas that are nice and lush and green, shorter habitat, wildflowers, less wildflowers, all kinds of stuff. And those are important, by the way, because different animals need different habitat types, but also different plants respond to different growing conditions. We can also use things like hay or mowing to alter that structure and change habitat conditions. We can go out with big machines to knock down trees if we can't get in there with fire, or if they get too big for fire. We can use herbicides, which have a bad reputation for good reasons in a lot of cases, but herbicides are really, really critical tools for us to have available to us. Because sometimes, for example, if you've got a bunch of deciduous trees you're trying to kill, and you're sick of cutting them down and watch them come back again, the only way to get them to stop coming back is to cut them down and paint the stump with a little bit of herbicide to kill the plant. And there are some plants that are pernicious enough invasive species that herbicide is useful. And if we use it selectively, use it in little spots, it's a really good tool. So, prairie stewardship basically wraps back into what we talked about earlier with resilience. We're managing for ecological resilience. We're trying to do that by providing a lot of different types of habitat out there for lots of different species, because the second piece is that species diversity. And then what we're really doing is we're managing competition. We're like a coach or a referee in a game, if you'd like to think about it that way. We want to make sure that everybody gets to win often enough that they stick around, and that nobody loses consistently enough that they take their ball and go home. So that's what managers are thinking about day to day. And the way that we stay sane, at least the way I stay sane as a land manager, is that I keep this in mind. It's not my job as a land manager today to fix the world around me. It's not. My job is to keep it operational so I can hand it off to the next generation and they can take it from there, right? Just like we've done for tens of thousands of years. That's a lot better way for me to see the world than trying to stress at night about how many things I'm behind on or what's not working. I'm coming up with ideas that my predecessors didn't. People after me will come up with even better ideas than that, okay? So I'm gonna end with a quick story about my favorite insect in the entire world, because I'm an insect enthusiast. I said that, right? Anybody know what it is? Oh, that's so sad. Okay, this is the camouflaged looper. Looper is another word for inchworm. Okay, so it's an inchworm. But the camouflaged looper feeds on flowers. Not only does it feed on flowers, it takes some of those flowers and it glues them to its back, because it has sticky saliva, it's got little hooks on its back. So it puts little flowers on its back to camouflage itself and hide from predators. Really good idea. If it switches to a different kind of flower, it changes its costume to match the new flower it's on. If those little bits of flower start to dry up, it replaces it with fresh ones to keep the costume looking good. Eventually, if everything goes well, it turns into this moth, which is called the wavy-lined emerald moth, which is fine. It's the caterpillar that's really cool. So, I saw this one a few years ago at our Niobrara Valley Preserve, north central Nebraska. I actually saw it while I was driving, which my wife still can't believe happened. But I'm a photographer who looks at little things, right? And I was driving by and something looked off about that sunflower, so I stopped and took a look, and sure enough, so I took pictures of it while I was picking up little bits of flour and eating them like a little ice cream cone. Gorgeous little adorable creature. But when I was done, I thought, you know what, there's a bunch of people back at headquarters that will really appreciate seeing this, and they'd all go home for the night. So I grabbed the sunflower, I snipped it off, took the sunflower and the caterpillar bolt back to the cabin with me. And I stuck it in a glass of water, put a different flower in there thinking maybe it would change its costume overnight, because wouldn't that be spectacular? And then I got worried and I put a little piece of paper towel underneath it so it wouldn't fall in the water and die, because that'd be sad. I went to bed. Oh, I put a glass over the top so it couldn't leave. That was the other thing I did, because that's smart. I went to bed. When I woke up in the morning, the first thing I did was I went to check on the camouflage looper, right? Did it change its costume overnight? Wouldn't that be amazing? And their answer is yes, it changed its costume. And that's why it's my favorite insect in the whole world. Thank you very much. Questions? Complaints? Thoughts? Yes, please.
So all those bees that are solitary in the ground, what are we doing to them when we burn?
Excellent question. So the question was, all those little solitary bees that are in the ground, what are we doing to them when we burn? A lot of that has to do with what time of year we burn, right? During the winter, most of them are under the ground. They're safe from fire. Fire doesn't have any impact on them. Even during the growing season, bees are easy because they can fly. So bees are at very low risk from fire. The temperature of fires doesn't really penetrate into the soil enough to have any impact on the eggs or anything below that. But let me extrapolate from your question a little bit, because any fire we do as managers is going to have a negative effect on something, right? If we burn in the winter or the early spring before the growing season, any insect that's overwintering in the thatch along the ground, any inside those stems, any of those things, they're going to have a big tough time because of the fire, right? But if we wait until the summer, when all those things are active, some of them will be able to move out of the way, but there's a whole lot more insects that are in the prairie. So a summer fire is also dangerous for insects, let alone things like snakes and other things, right? Many of them, this has been happening for thousands and thousands of years, so they're adapted to this to some extent, right? They can get down in those badger holes, for example, and get away. But any fire has impacts. We have to know that and live with it like we have for tens of thousands of years. And one of the keys is to be smart about how we use fire. So for example, most of the time, if we have a 200-acre prairie or a 100-acre prairie, we'll only burn half of it, right? So that if we have an impact, we're only having an impact on part of that site, and then we'll wait a while before we burn the second one so everything has a chance to survive. And I think that's the best we can do. But thank you for the question, it's a good one.